Talk to. Welcome, Robert. And next to me is the current advisor on the European Union and to the Dutch Prime Minister, the Sherpa, so to speak, Saïd Fazili, freshly appointed in September. And previously, Saïd worked very closely with Robert de Groot as his Amtichi at the European Union Permanent Representation of the Netherlands in Brussels. And before that, he worked in fields like migration and European integration at the Dutch Ministry for Foreign Affairs. So he knows the Dutch debate very well. By way of introducing you, just a quick first question to have a sneak preview of who we have in the room. Now, the French Minister for Europe, Clément Beaune, in his keynote speech, emphasized that for a long time, the European project was rather internally oriented, internal markets, those domains. Recently, we are moving to more external challenges like the rise of China, migration, climate change, geopolitical rivalry, security issues. And for that, he said, Europe has to learn to exercise power. It needs to make more explicit what it stands for. And all this requires a political narrative. Do you feel this pressure in your daily work, Saïd? The urgency of narratives in this pressing context.
Well, thanks, Monika, and also thank you very much for the invitation. And it's an honor to be here, actually at the place where I did my first diplomatic training in 2001, I think. So it's great to be back at Clingendael.
Thank you.
Maybe on narratives, I think it's I'm always a bit hesitant to enter into kind of discussions that evolve into words and where the Brussels bubble gets very enthusiastic from, but doesn't really solve the main day-to-day problems people are faced with. So I think it's better to focus on the big issues we see coming ahead of us, and in the field of climate, autonomy, in the field of digitalization. And I think we should look for practical solutions and not lose ourselves in word discussion around words.
Very good. A narrative skeptic in the room and at the table. I think it's good to bring those reality checks in the discussion as well. Of course, think tankers like to discuss narratives, academics like to discuss them, but do they resonate among the public? Do they work for politicians? So these are important strategic questions to discuss here as well. Understand in the meantime that we have some connection problems with Brussels, is that correct? Because then I will move on. There is Robert. Very good, Robert. Just in time.
Just in time, indeed.
Thank you so much for that introductory question. Do you feel this push in the direction of being more explicit about our narratives that Clément Beaune indicated?
Well, thank you, Monika. And also from my side, as a former Clingendael alumni, great to be back. Mine dates from the previous century, so that's a slight difference. So also on the narrative side, I think you cannot make them, you cannot create them. They arise over time. And I think the fundamentals of the European narrative have not changed. They are our values and they are our social model. So I agree with the fact that we have to adapt to the present situation and the challenges of the coming years. But I think the basics of our narrative do not change.
Thank you. So I will try to push you a little bit on the relevance of narratives in this hour and to reflect on the strategic material that has been brought to the table in the 10 previous panels. We said at the start of the conference, there are 5 urgent reasons to do reflect on our European strategy and narratives. First, great power narratives, the geopolitical rivalry that forces the European Union to be more explicit for what it stands for and where it wants to go. Second, the paradigm changes that are taking place partially in relation to that geopolitical changes, the role of the state, and that is brought back in industrial policy, trade policy, climate policies. We see a more geopolitical role for Europe alongside the transatlantic cooperation. And we see new narratives on alliances that change post-Brexit. So paradigmatic changes that need to be discussed also with the public, we feel. Third, the assignment to overcome diversity among EU member states. That becomes more and more highly politically salient. Do we need to discuss that and make new narratives like solidity and solidarity for the Eurozone? Or do we unnecessarily politicize things by making narratives explicit? So it becomes even harder to overcome that highly politically salient diversity. Then fourth, the return of European crisis, polycrisis for Europe, so to speak, that arises from the increased interdependence in the economic sphere. And we see that there is a push to be more explicit on social and political aspects of integration, social and cultural, aspects of integration because of that high interdependence in the economic domain. What are the conditions for solidarity in next gen EU? And what are the conditions for having the Schengen zone when migration is up? So this push to more social and cultural issues and the need to be more explicit in our narratives in these domains as well. And finally, how are we going to involve the public in these strategic choices and narrative building? Do they feel represented? Do they care about these new narratives? And does it pay off for a political leader to be explicit? Or will it just mean that there's an easy criterion along which his performance can be measured if you have a very explicit narrative? So we will alternate these discussions along these 5 big themes with questions from the audience. And for that, my colleague Nienke van Heukelingen is here in the studio. Nienke will collect questions from the audience. So feel free to type your questions right away so that we can bring in the audience already during the conversation and not only at the end. Here we have the radiant Nienke. Hello. So let's start with the global context. Robert, you live and work in this context, very close to the European Council, to the European leaders. What is your assessment of the challenges and trends in the global context that demand strategic and narrative work? Robert.
Well, thank you. I think that's a very good way of starting the discussion, to look at the world around us, the world around the European Union, and the world around Europe. If you, for example, look at the facts, look at the agenda of the Foreign Affairs Council over the past couple of years, and look at the agenda of European councils and how they have evolved over the past 3 to 4 years. And years back, I think most European councils only concentrated on issues which had to do with saving the Eurozone. And then after that, we came into the migration crisis, which was the primary target of leaders to discuss. And you see nowadays, and over the past 2 years, increasingly, they have put on the agenda issues which have to do with the global positioning of the European Union, of Europe. And I think that's quite a significant and interesting development. And there's a substantial increase in the amount of time spent by leaders on global issues. They have discussed not once, not twice, but several times the relationship with China. They have done this on several occasions concerning Russia. They do so with the United States. Only last week, there was a big discussion at the council level to prepare for the Trade and Technology Council, the European Union and the US head in Pittsburgh yesterday. They have discussed sanctions regime. The European Union now has an instrument for the international stage, which has to do with human rights sanctions, for example, but also with those which are the consequence of cyber attacks on our societies. So you can see that increasingly they are trying to get to grips with the changing world around us. Even President von der Leyen at her start 2 years ago, as president of the Commission, talked about that she wanted to be a geopolitical commission. I certainly see that we have geopolitical European councils today. So that is, I think, factual what we see. Now, what are the consequences of these discussions? You can already see that happening in Brussels today. That means increased competitions for funds within the European Commission, funds we use for partnerships in the East, the Eastern Partnership, funds we use for partnerships in the South, which have to do with migration, but also in the Southeast with Turkey. And there are even proposals today to have a European variant to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which also show how active we are starting to become on the international stage. So these funds have to do also with the global positioning of the EU, but also we want to stay globally competitive in the world economy. And that feeds back into the discussions we have about the digital transformation of our societies, what this means, how we have to deal with data, with artificial intelligence, etc. And even these subjects we cannot decide on only within the 27 members of the European Union. We do have to do this at the international stage, and preferably with a like-minded country like the United States of America, but also with Canada and some others. The same with the Green Deal and the Fit for 55 package to reduce CO2 emissions. There too, there are many blocks on this earth which have to decide on where to go collectively. We will do that at a huge conference in Glasgow later in the year. But there too, we see a very active European Union in the case of Vice President Timmermans, together with his US counterpart, Mr. Kerry. And the same holds for the WTO. Now, a new area of discussion is defense. It's quite clear that Europe needs to do more and needs to be able to do more itself. And this is why the European Union is developing a strategic compass, as it's called, which will come to the European Council in March of 2022. And there's also discussion on the concept of strategic autonomy, which means what should the European Union be able to do on its own in defense matters, but also in economic matters. So this is already a new narrative evolving, but it's taking shape. It should be given the shape it will have finally together with 27. And this is, I think, what we will be working on in the coming year. Thank you, Monika.
Well, thank you so much, Robert, for setting the scene. And we will return to what I already heard in your answer, as some paradigmatic shifts and bringing the state in, the funds that you mentioned, and the turn to a more more strategic responsibility, I would call it, in Europe, where it comes to our security and defense. Maybe I can ask you one question on China, because on the first day we had various panels on China, and there the European level has been important in indicating a significant paradigm shift, I would say, where it comes to the rise of China, by saying that we should not be naive, saying, and this is a cooperation partner, it is a competitor, and it's a systemic rival. And that last word has set the tone since then, very much so here in The Hague. We discussed that with several academics, plus Karin Musselechner, that because of the insistence on the human rights issue, the space for being a cooperation partner diminishes. How do you feel? Has it been possible to do these three things alongside each other, being a cooperation partner, and competitor, and pleading for fair competition in the world, and being a systemic rival, with parliaments so keen on making this more or less the main issue in the relationship? How has it felt in Brussels?
Well, the relationship with China is very complex. It's a multi-track relationship, and there are various aspects you mentioned, and there are various concerns we have about what's going on inside China, and also what China is doing elsewhere in this world. At the same time, they are there on this earth, and if we want to do something, for example, on global challenges like COVID or climate, we cannot just neglect China. On the contrary, they are a very important partner. So I think we have to accept that we have to deal with counterparts that in some aspects we can work with, and we want to work with, and we need to work with, while there are other aspects where we utterly disagree with what is happening. And there's even a link between the two. Because if we can work together in doing something on CO2 reductions worldwide, this also gives us the opportunity to speak our minds on things when it comes to forced labor or human rights. So I think these are not only separate tracks that do not meet. I think the opportunity of several tracks is that you can bring messages to them which we want them to hear from us.
Okay, thank you. And Saïd, when you listen to Robert and refer to your own experience here already in The Hague since September, do you also sense these paradigmatic changes? Where do you see them? Please.
No. Thanks, and I always listen very carefully to what Robert says, of course. And I think definitely that the EU is adapting to the circumstances. And I'm not sure if that's a paradigm shift as such, but I think the strength of the EU is that we always adapted to the situations. whether after the fall of the Iron Curtain, we've become a very different EU, adopting or integrating new member states to the EU. So we've always looked to the world around us. And at the same time, and I will dive into it a bit more, we've always taken into account our own societies and developments in societies. And have adopted national policies and tried to expose them at a European level. So I think both outwards and inwards, the EU is a layer in between that has adopted to that. And if I start outwards, maybe on 2 points, and I think you've also already discussed them this week, it's about industrial policy and economic or trade policy. And I remember when I started working on European integration, trade policy was quite simple because the narrative was trade is always good, and the more trade, the better. And there was a wide range of member states, including the United Kingdom, that fully supported that. And always, if any member state would question that, they would always get the label of protectionism and protectionist. And I think this narrative has been around for a very long time. But what I've seen in the last couple of years, also due to maybe to the rise of China or to other competitors, is that the question came on the European tables, are we not too naive on trade policy? And should we not sometimes defend ourselves? Because some countries use trade for political reasons, not just for trade reasons, as we've always seen it. And I think what we have seen, and I think maybe also because of the narrative of systemic rival or other narratives, for example, that the discussion on trade defense instruments or screening investments that come from other parts of the world to look at, is this meant as a economic investment, or are there any political reasons behind this investment? And I think because of the worldwide shift, I think also our thinking there, the Dutch thinking, and the Dutch thinking about trade has shifted, and we accept, and I think we have also integrated that that trade isn't economic, but also can be used for political reasons, and we must, as society and as internal market, be aware of these challenges. So I think,
I think very well. So besides that, Tom de Bruijn also mentioned, besides these more negative or defensive reasons to think differently about trade policy, he also mentioned more positive reasons, saying that you can also use the trade instrument for social or climate broader public objectives, integrating those objectives more in your trade policies. Do you recognize that as well?
Yeah, I think there's also been a shift there, that the trade is not about quota for goods, or about standards for goods, but it's also about broader standards in the field of climate, in the field of sustainability, in the field of labor rights. And I think this is also something that has come both from a worldwide discussion as well as out of our own societies, and that people demand to know that if goods are imported into the EU, that they're produced in a sustainable manner. So I think that is important. If you look at the more positive side, because you mentioned the role of the state as well, I think if you look in the future in the modern economies, there are, for example, some products where our partners and also our competitors are way more advanced than we are. And for example, if you look in the field of semiconductors or microchips, we know that this will be the key element of our future economy. Maybe what oil was through the 20th century, microprocessors or batteries for that matter are those for the 21st century. And we see that European production and the European ecosystem there, we're not producing as much as the big companies in Asia or in the United States, but I think there's a strong political will to do that as well, together with our partners. So I think there it's a very technical project in the EU called the IPCEY, the Important Projects of Common European Interest, where we say together, let's have state investment, bring it together with companies, with research institutions to develop cutting edge technologies, and thereby linking it up to our industry, to the, for example, German car industries, that if they want to drive electronic cars, they would need microchips as well. So I think this is a kind of state intervention where you see that because for the market, this is such a high risk investment, it's difficult to find market investors. And there the state has a role. And I think there you have seen a shift as well. where a couple of years ago in our Dutch thinking about the role of the state, you wouldn't have seen this back. Maybe, if I'm not sure how many minutes I have, one other example, because something that has come out also out of our societies is, for example, the thinking on climate change, which is a huge topic. And I think also there you've seen that we are realizing that if we want to reach zero pollution in 2050, or zero CO2 pollution in 2050, we have to start today. And we're very glad that the Commission came with the Fit for 55 package to have 55% reduction in 2030. But that also entails a big role of the state and the European Union in setting standards, developing new markets for CO2 reduction. And this is something that is a little bit new how we do business, not completely, of course, but the size of a package is so big that you need state intervention and a big role of the state to ensure a level playing field in Europe, so that our companies can compete with each other and a worldwide level playing field. So I think this has also been a paradigm shift coming out of a wish of our societies to do something in the field of climate change. And there you need at the EU level an approach and something which is quite new to all of us, how to do this. And this will be what Robert also will be negotiating the coming 1 or 2 years to find a balance between the 27 countries, how to do this. So I think there are all these developments coming from outside, coming from our societies. I think they constitute the paradigm shift. And it's not because we have created a new narrative at world stage. It's because this is demanded of us.
Absolutely.
To come back at your first question.
Yeah. But we have indeed said that narratives are not about spin or words. They are about underlying political conflicts. And there have been conflicts about the relevance of climate objectives. There have been conflicts about the relevance of social objectives in relation to economic growth or other important objectives. And now the balance turns more to also other broad public goals like security, innovation, climate change policies and social policies, and that then materialize in a narrative, but it's about underlying strategic choices for sure. Thanks, Saïd. Let's move to Nienke, because she signaled that there are already questions from the audience. Nienke.
Yeah. Thank you, Monika. Well, we just discussed trade and the Dutch position. Laura Oostdam also has a question about that Dutch position, but more focused on European defense. The Netherlands has recently taken a more proactive stance towards European defense cooperation, such as in the case of the EU Indo-Pacific strategy. How might the changing geopolitical context impact on this stance in the foreseeable future? This is maybe a question that I would like to ask Mr. Fazili.
Yeah. No. So thanks. No, I think the different stance of the Netherlands on defense matters might not be so different than is maybe perceived in the question. I think there's a realization that the EU should be a global player and not a global playing field. And if we want to prevent being a playing field, we have to be active in the world. First of all, of course, at our own continent and in our neighboring regions, but also further away. For us, it's without any doubt that everything we do in the EU always goes hand in hand with what we do with our transatlantic partners and within the NATO framework. But it's also clear that we have to make sure that our own strategic interests, we can defend them as well as possible. And that goes for the Indo-Pacific as well, because we have huge interest there. And if you only look at our trade relations with China, our historical relations with Indonesia, and the potential for conflict in the region, it makes a lot of sense to be very active there. So I think this is also a realization that comes out of the shift in the global setting in geopolitics, and I think it's not such a big shift as maybe being perceived, and I see it as a continuation of our policy. But I think the accents have been made a little bit different. Also because what Mrs. von der Leyen said when we started the new commission, that this is a geopolitical commission. So I think this is also a translation of the commitments we have set a couple of years ago.
Yeah, so no paradigm shift where it comes to transatlantic ties, towards the union. The two should support each other. That is very much the Dutch narrative, if I hear Saïd. Maybe moving on to that third reason to discuss strategy and narratives, the fierce clashes as a result of the diversity among member states. And we've discussed in several panels that the discussions on European narratives are moving from economic to more social and cultural themes. Maria de Mercis was mentioning that before it was north-south, on economic issues, but now, as we have to be solidarious, show solidarity in the context of next gen, etc., it becomes more and more also on cultural themes. And the Netherlands is among the hardliners in these debates, for instance, on the rule of law. Whereas, for instance, President Tusk has warned that we should take the Polish debates on a Polish exit seriously. So why is it, Saïd, that the Netherlands is pushing so hard, so close to the edge?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, but I think my first response to that question would be that the EU is a very diverse group of member states, of 27. And within that, within a very loose framework, so everybody has the right to develop his or her society as they want. And I think where we have a commonality is in our what Robert also in the beginning said, our common values, which are enshrined in the Treaty of the European Union, among others, Article 2 of that treaty. And there are some common values. And they're also there for a reason. One is that we're a community of values, and we have to stick to those. We're all democratic countries with all democratic constitutions. And this treaty is meant to ensure we all uphold those values. But there's also an economic logic to it. If we have an internal market, if we have an internal room called Schengen, where people can work and live in each other's countries, if we have external borders together, it makes sense that in that internal space where we work and live and earn our livings, that we can rely on each other's systems, because we're not like the US with one legal system. We have 27 different legal systems. The important thing there is that we all interpret our European commitments in the same way. And I think this legal framework is the basis of what we do. So it's not a question, if I look at Poland, for example, that we have something against Poland. Poland is one of the most important countries in the European Union. What we have a problem with is if the independence of the Polish judiciary is undermined and is put under political surveillance, because we cannot be sure at that moment that whatever a Dutch company invests and they have a problem, that there can be an independent legal opinion on that question. Or, for example, if there's a question of misuse of European funds, that there's an independent investigation with an independent legal question. So this is not something of the Netherlands not liking countries, or we wanted to push our values on other countries, but this is something that every country signed up to when they became a member of the EU. And the only thing we want to do is ask these countries and ask the Commission to make sure we all uphold the same values in the EU and we stick to the same rules, because I think this is the economic and political logic behind our common system.
Thank you. And Robert, could you maybe bring in your experience in Brussels? What helps to overcome highly politically salient diversity among member states? How can we achieve consensus in such sensitive domains?
Well, yes, in that sense, Monika, I have to disagree with you that we are a hardliner. I don't have that feeling at all. Mm-hmm. I think the overwhelming majority of member states, just like Saïd said, feel we have to stick, one, to the treaties, two, to the role of the Commission in the guardian and being the guardian of the treaties, mm-hmm. and three, in the legal system we have built up with all member states, including the primacy of the EU law, which is guaranteed through the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. So I don't have the feeling that we have a special position in that discussion in Brussels. And you can see also from the yearly rule of law report, which is now made up annually by the Commission, this Commissioner Reinders, that also the Commission is taking this very seriously, is not criticizing or making comments on the structure of the rule of law in a member state, because that is something which has historic origins, but they're looking very much at the application of EU rules and regulations. And if there is a problem, I think it's first and foremost the role of the Commission to enter into a dialogue with the specific member states. And I'm sure there are remarks made on every member state, including the Netherlands. And we should first try and have a dialogue with the Commission on how to proceed. And after that, there are the legal steps which go through the infringement system, and then it goes to the Court of Justice. So I think the system we have in place is quite strong. We see, however, that in some member states, there are different ideas on how to evolve into the future. And we are very happy with having bestowed on the Commission the collective responsibility as guardian of the treaties to make sure that we are all treated in the same way.
Okay, Robert, if we're speaking about relations between member states, a lot has happened, of course, as well, post-Brexit, with new policy challenges coming up. How do you see this working out in terms of the narratives that we tell around key partners in Europe? For instance, France, that used to be the bad guy in the stories of that the Netherlands told, whereas now Clément Beaune was the keynote speaker. We see Rutte and Macron. There are new narratives being told about the relationships post-Brexit and in light of new challenges. How do you see that playing out, especially in the relationship with France and post-Merkel with Germany?
Well, you're right. I think the departure of the UK is a game changer indeed. And I think we all have to adjust to not having the UK around the table, and especially for the Netherlands in many areas, specifically when it comes to the internal market, trade, and the economy, we were very like-minded. And we don't have this partner around the table anymore. So in that sense, things change and we have to look for new allies. So you've seen over the past couple of years, many initiatives to look for new variations in allies. We've had the Hanse initiative by the Dutch Minister of Finance, Wopke Hoekstra. There are other traditional ones which have been there from even the time before the EU, which is the Benelux, but increasingly you see meetings of the Benelux with the Baltic states. For example, when it comes to the digital transformation of our societies, we work very closely together with Spain. And even when it comes to the internal market, there are interests which are very much aligned, for example, with a country like Poland. So I think there are, because the world is changing, there are also different alliances coming up. Let's mention the Defense Alliance, which was concluded by Greece and France only the other day. So I think for the next couple of years, we will see more changes in that sense, which means that we are adapting to a new world.
Yeah. So what does this require, these new patterns, these new alliances of the Dutch government? Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it's. I think on the one hand, we have what I see at the European Council and at the level of the leaders is also that the longer you're there, the more impact you can also have, because you know how the discussions go, you know the content. And in that sense, of course, someone like Angela Merkel, who has been there for 16 years in the European Council, has an enormous knowledge, and her departure will be felt. At the same time, our own Prime Minister Mark Rutte has been there now for 10 years. And I think part of his effectiveness is also his knowledge, his way of operating at the European Council level. And you also see that newer members also come up to him to see how they should do that, should be effective at the European Council level. So I think that's not so much an alliance, but it's a kind of a seniority that comes along with being a long time in the European Council. Yeah. At the same time, I think it's important to realize that probably 90% of EU legislation does not go to the European Council. And in the end, the European Council doesn't decide on legislation. They give more of the strategic guidance. Mm-hmm. So I think it's for any government in Europe, and also for the new Dutch government, it's important that all ministers are fully aware of what's happening in the Council, and that they go to Brussels and they negotiate all this legislation, all these different Council formats, because this is where it really happens. And in the end, things only go to the European Council, what Robert said, in the field of migration or the euro, when they're really the problems that are too big to solve for ministers. But I think the strength of the European Union is also our community method, which goes through the Council. So I would think, and I'm sure this is also the message any new cabinet in the Netherlands would get, is go to Brussels, invest in Brussels, go to the Council, go to European Parliament, and know your commissioner.
Yeah, relevant message to all the ministers, not just the Prime Minister or the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Very well heard. Nienke, are there questions related to these topics, diversity among member states, rule of law, new alliances in Europe?
Definitely. Yeah, we, as you said, we touched upon the diversity among member states and how the Netherlands is among the hardliners in certain debates. Peter Langenberg wants to know how much the Dutch EU narrative can actually differ from the European one. Like, is that like how far can you go, basically? Mr. De Groot, may I ask you to answer this question?
Well, thank you. And I think if we are having a discussion on a proposal by the Commission, we can all ventilate our position. And usually they don't really align from the first meeting. But in the end, if there is a proposal, and most proposals are welcomed by member states, we will have to find a compromise. So I think it's very easy and not very difficult. And I think that the way we work together with 27 member states, the amount of legislative proposals which is agreed upon by the European Parliament each year, is substantial, which shows how much we in the end do agree on things which matter to citizens around Europe. So, let's look on the one hand at the openness of the dialogue we are having, the room there is to have diverse opinions, but also look at the disciplines of politicians across Europe to, in the end, find a compromise which brings us forward. There are areas, however, where there are quite some deep disagreements. That's true. And these require time to be brought to the next level. But I think with the questions they discuss, the issues they discuss are very complex and work out so differently for member states that I think this is understandable. But in the end, there's always the desire to compromise. And I think this is what we should keep in mind.
And Robert, do you feel that the Netherlands is seen as the leader of the frugal, as the one who in a way succeeds the UK, the kind of the one to oppose. Do you feel that the Netherlands is framed like that in Brussels?
Well, we are not the UK. We will never be the UK, neither in size nor in geographic location. We are a continental European country. We have been a member from the start of the European Union, and we know our future lies in the European Union. So we are not the UK. I don't think we are seen as the UK. When it comes to the frugal, this was one specific group of like-minded countries. We had the negotiations on the multi-annual financial framework, the 7-year budget of the EU. And it's true, when it comes to finance and budget, we are in the position that we can be quite frugal, but in the end also here we compromise. But I don't see the word frugal being applied to us on many other files.
Yeah, so indeed, by having different alliances in different domains, you have distinguish different positions, and
indeed,
for instance, in the field of migration or in the field of climate, alliances differ. That is clear. Maybe let's move to the last urgent reason to have these debates about strategy and narratives. That is to bring the public in as one way, potentially or not, to bring the public into the European discussions. There have been complaints that integration is moving on by stealth. We had the referendum in the Netherlands, of course. We had the narrative, Europe is quite important. We had the narrative, no more money to Greece. But yeah, how does it pay off for politicians to have these narratives? And is a narrative effective in involving the public? These are also strategic questions. Maybe I can start with Saïd, who already showed that he's a little bit narrative skeptic. Saïd.
Yeah, I think that's 26 point Scrabble world, narrative skeptic. So that's a good one. No, I think it's I think that the answer to my skepticism lies to the diversity of the agenda. So if you have an agenda from migration to the Euro crisis to digitalization, I don't see how one narrative could ever fit. And the only narrative could be Europe is quite important. But that one failed a couple of years ago. So let's not go there again. I think it's important to realize that whatever we do and our position on files, we have discussed that with our parliament. We have a cabinet which changes every couple of years, and they all have to position themselves towards a certain topic. And then that becomes the narrative. But that narrative is never set in stone. On the one hand, because coalitions change in the Netherlands, or the public feelings change, or parliament changes. On the other hand, and there is my, also from my Brussels experience, always a bit difficult, is that the playing field in Brussels changes. So it's easy to have a narrative in the beginning of a process saying we want this or we won't want that. But if you see that 26 other countries are moving in the opposite direction, you either have to break your narrative or change your narrative. And I think that makes it complicated because we're not alone in the EU. So I rather have a good position on a topic in a transparent process with our parliament where all the pros and cons are being discussed. And this is an instruction and whereby Robert afterwards can go negotiating. And then at the end of the negotiations, we feed it back to Parliament and we say, well, this is what we managed to do based on your instruction. Please, is it enough or is it not enough? Mm-hmm. And I think this is our democratic process. I personally don't see the added value of adding a narrative on top of that because it becomes a bit set in stone and a bit more inflexible.
Robert, you said something slightly different in the beginning, because you emphasized that the narrative is in our values. Now, we discussed in several panels that if you want to distinguish Europe from China, for instance, or from the US even, although the distance between the two is absolutely not the same, then we go in the direction of these values, but also of our institutions. That's to say, we have the democratic state, we have rule of law, but we also have relatively strong welfare states in Europe that distinguish us from the United States. We have secular states that distinguish us from many societies around us. Science is really the basis, the institution for knowledge. So you could also, many panelists said, for instance, Mark Algaarders, you could distinguish Europe and its narrative by the values and these institutions that in a way also will show the direction when you're dealing with access to your market or with standards for your products. What do you think about adding these institutions to the values that you mentioned, Robert?
I think these values, which you are right, are extremely European. I think institutions and also European institutions in all their dealings on the global stage breathe the values of Europe. Mm-hmm. And let's be honest, if we work together, for example, with the US on a global issue like reduction of the emission of greenhouse gases, trying to achieve the 2030, 2050 goals, we have set ourselves. We are not negotiating with a country with identical values, but we are discussing with a country which we regard as being like-minded. I think that is something different. Mm-hmm. So I think we cannot agree globally on issues which are very close to our heart if we only want to deal with those who have identical values. So I think we should not aim for that. So the importance is to reach the goals we want to reach globally, to be true to the values you have. And that means also through our institutions, and that you're quite right, defend the social model and the rule of law we regard as so important. But I don't think we will get very far globally if we insist on having identical values first before we want to talk.
No, that is a point that also resulted from various discussions that we have. How universal will those values and institutions be, and how to cooperate in a world in which you will have varying civilizations next to each other for the time being. Back to that question is how to involve the public when it comes to narrative, and does it pay off for a political leader to be explicit about his political narrative? Saïd, we haven't heard much from your boss after No More Money to Greece and etc. He's the one who's supposed to be not too enthusiastic about visions and narratives. What are the disadvantages of being explicit about the narrative?
No, I think I can't speak for the Prime Minister, but what I see is that he doesn't maybe have one sentence on the EU, but I think in his way of dealing with the EU, I think it's clear he sees Europe as both an economic market and a community of values. Mm-hmm. And I think on the value side, he attaches great importance to things like the rule of law. And on the economic side, to free open markets and open trade. I think those are important. So I don't think he is explicit about one narrative, but in his way of talking about the EU, you can distinguish some liberal, which is not trends, which is not strange for the leader of the Liberal Party, but a very liberal way of looking to the EU as a community of values, as an internal market, and more as a global actor. And I think in the last couple of years, I remember a speech I gave in Zurich some years ago. I think we also explained that you need to stick together around the campfire, so to say, and the campfire being Brussels in that sense, if you have external threats. And I think this is something that is important. And I think Brexit also shows that it's lonely out there, and you need a community of friends and like-minded to be able to deal with the outside world. So I think this is maybe it's not a one sentence, but I think in the way of doing business, this is a very a clear view for me on how my prime minister and our cabinet see the EU.
Robert, what is your assessment among the European leaders? Does it pay off to have a very explicit narrative, or does it only tie your hands? So it's really more difficult to achieve consensus. Will you be held to account if you have been explicit back in your parliament? So is Europe much more on depoliticizing things? Is narrative politicizing things? How do you assess among European leaders whether it pays off to have this explicit narrative or not?
Well, I think European leaders all act differently in that sense. There are some we know who have a very explicit narrative, who use this extensively back home. And there are others who come from a more broad democratic society where they have multi-party governments and not one single party. So I think this differs across Europe. At the same time, in the end, like I said before, they have to take a decision, which is usually a compromise. In some societies in Europe, having a very explicit narrative, but in the end, compromising on a decision are two things which go together quite easy. In others, that would be much more difficult. So I think it differs across Europe. There's a lot of color, there's a lot of political culture, there's a lot of emotion in many of these discussions. And I don't think it's a choice between either or. I think each political culture back home has its own color. We know that, so we can read what's happening in another country and why it is said or done in one way. But that's up to everybody. That's the individual room member states have.
Thanks, Robert. And to speak of the public, let's go to Nienke for a last question. Nienke.
Yeah, Monika, you asked the question, how to include the public in making narratives to the two gentlemen. But Nicole de Tombe, most likely European citizen, asked the questions, why do European citizens need these narratives anyway?
Maybe I would not be the one answering this because I have a question to my heart.
Maybe I can ask this question to Mr. De Groot.
Concluding words to you, Robert.
It is a very good question, but I think we all want to know and need to know why governments are taking decisions in a specific direction. Why are we taking decisions which have impact on our societies, on the way we live, on the way we move from one country to the other, on the currency we have. So I think all these issues require explanation by politicians to their citizens why these decisions are taken. So I feel, and like Saïd Fazili said, politicians have to be transparent about what they are doing to their publics, either through their national parliament and through the European system, also through the European Parliament, and of course through the media. So I see the need for a narrative also as an explanation to their publics why we have to take sometimes very difficult decisions.
Yeah, so it requires courage, political courage, also in a way, to make clear what we stand for and where we're heading. So there is indeed political diversity and also an element of choice here. I want to thank Robert de Groot and Saïd Fazili, Nienke, and the public for their active participation in this panel. As we conclude this State of the Union conference, I want to thank thoroughly the team that made all this possible. That is, of course, Nienke, who organized the conference with me, Inge Kaars, Joris Knikking, Saskia Legijn, our interns Mirte and Laura. Thank you so much, together with all the colleagues who moderated and contributed to the panels. Thank you very much. You can find the entire harvest of the conference on our website and on our YouTube channel. Have a very good day. Bye-bye.